It's the Arch Advocate Podcast, Friday edition. Oh boy, we're going off the rails today, talking about biblical prophecy. Been wanting to kind of get to this for quite a while. So for you for example, like the crypto creeps, like the old faithfuls, yeah, we're not talking about cryptocurrencies today. We're going to be talking about biblical prophecy. Now listen, I want to thank everybody for even, as we are 40 seconds into this podcast, I want to say thank you for still being here. All right, we're going to get weird today. All right, we're going to do it together, and I would like to take a moment to say, hey, you know what? Thank you for hitting subscribe. Like if you're listening on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, even on the the Libsyn Direct, like if you hit subscribe, that totally helps me out. I'm not going to get into why, but it does. Right? So it's literally almost as close to zero effort as you can get just by hitting that button. If you want to become a Patreon member and support the show financially, you can do that too. You can go on to archadvocate.com. arch-advocate.com. That is my website. It's I got to make some changes to that actually this weekend. But thanks for all of that, you guys. It's not free for me to do the podcast, so when you guys chip in a couple of bucks, it helps, right? The problem with prophecy, right? Let me just put it to you this way. The problem with prophecy is just like the problem with gravity. You can't prove it, right? Now the example of gravity is like, well, we know that gravity is there, and we can prove its effects mathematically, right? Like we can drop something from a high place or throw it out of an airplane or whatever, and we can calculate the rate of descent and whatever because we've figured certain things out about gravity. But gravity itself, as far as like the graviton, we know that gravity is energy and that everything in the universe is energy, and we have found a great deal of different types of energy particles, but we have yet to find the graviton, right? The energy particle that causes gravity. We haven't found it yet, and so therefore, you can't prove it, right? You know it's there, but you can't really prove it. Now, I have been reluctant to talk about prophecy for good reason, right? And the number one reason is because I can't stand it when other people do. Right? It's one of those things that's on my list of things that I don't like in this world. I have, growing up as a Christian, growing up in the church, I have seen every abuse of faith possible when it comes to prophecy. There's a guy right now, his name is Mark, and he's like a professional prophet, right? Like a prophetic guy, and he travels around and churches pay him a bunch of money to come in and prophesy. And I've seen this guy stand on stage and literally, during like ministry time, like after all the service is over and everybody comes up front for prayer and whatever, everybody flocks, to the church when there's a prophet in town, and I've always seen this as kind of like bizarre behavior. Like, why are you waiting to hear from your God from a guy? Like, why are you doing that? That seems like a classic blunder. It's like, everything that's ever gone wrong in religion is because of that concept there. Like, why are you waiting for somebody else to speak on behalf of this being that clearly he talks to that guy? Why doesn't he talk to you? Does he not like you? Is that why you have to wait for the prophet to come to town to hear from your God? You know what I mean? And the thing is that these people, these self-proclaimed prophets, that's how they make their money, right? And so there is money changes everything. And in a lot of cases, when it comes to things like that, money ruins everything. When it comes to matters of faith and spirituality, it's like money. Now listen, I'm a big fan of money. I'm a huge capitalist. I love capitalism, right? Love it. But there's certain places where money doesn't belong. Like in your faith, you know what I mean? Well, actually, I take that back. There's... you can use money as an expression of compassion, and I think that that's a beautiful thing. So let me just try to come. Anyways, so I see this guy. His name is Mark. I'm not going to go any further than that, but I remember one time he was standing on stage, and everybody was like, "Oh, I hope he comes and has a word, from God for me. Because that's what happens when the prophet comes to town, right? When the guest speaker, the guest prophet comes to town, is everybody's like, ooh, please. They all go up front. It's like, oh, I got my hand up because I'm praying. I'm all spiritual. Like, please come give me a word. And this guy was talking. He's like, oh, I got this word from you. This little girl. She wasn't a little. She was like a teenager. Her name was Heather. And he goes, I see something from the Lord. He's saying that, like, your future, your career path, it's gonna be something with your hands. It's gonna be, your hands are gonna be your hands. It's like, and I just remember it, like, sitting there in my chair, because I've always been respectful. I'm not gonna get up and walk out, but I remember sitting there looking at that, like, you mean like the two hands that she has attached to her arms, because we are bipeds? Because we're bilateral and everybody has two arms and two legs and 2 feet. Those two hands, like, oh, God's gonna do something that's gonna require your hands. You know what I mean? Like, and it wasn't just the level of BS that I was witnessing. It was the fact that everybody was buying it. You know what I mean? Like, everybody was like, ooh, you got a word from the prophet, Heather. Ooh. By the way, there was also no coincidence that this girl, Heather, who was a sweet kid, and she's a lovely woman, and now she's married and she has like a bunch of kids, and her husband are happy. But, she was also very much blood related to the staff of the church, the pastors and a whole bunch of other staff, because it was, there was a lot of nepotism going on in that particular church. And it's a good church, but it just, it's like, come on. You mean to tell me that you don't have a little incentive to give a word from the Lord to, the pastor's niece? You know what I mean? Really? There's nothing to see there? Okay, whatever. But the point is like, that's just one example. I could do this all day. I can give you example after example of the horrible abuses that I've seen in the name of prophecy, right? Which is a spiritual concept to the Christian and to the Jew and to a lot of other religions, that prophecy is a sacred thing. And it should be, right? I believe in prophecy, right? I believe that the prophets in the Bible, right? Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah and like all the, Hosea, there's a whole bunch of them, right? And I believe that these men, when they spoke on behalf of the Lord, that was truly the words coming from God. I believe that. There's another side of prophecy, though. Most people always think prophecy is like predicting the future. And it's not. I mean, that's one component of it, but the main component of prophecy is just speaking on behalf of God. So like when Jeremiah, the prophet, if you're an atheist, I appreciate you sticking around, all right? I appreciate that you're a fan of this show, whatever. And I would hope that you do stick around. But listen, if you check out right now, I understand. Right? But, if you're an atheist now, but you grew up going to, Sunday school and, that sort of thing, like, the names of the prophets of the Old Testament, right? Jeremiah. Like, I believe that when Jeremiah, was rebuking the king or the high priest or whatever of Israel at the time, that was prophecy. When he was saying, like, you people are screwing up and you're hurting people's faith and whatever, like, that's prophecy. He wasn't predicting the future, although there were other places where Jeremiah did predict the future. But mostly prophecy is like when King David's prophet Nathan said to him, like, why have you slept with this woman and killed her husband, or had her husband killed? That was prophecy. It wasn't predicting the future. It was divining the past, but prophecy nonetheless. It was speaking the words of God, right? So prophecy, it's a crazy thing. And it's hard to believe. And when you talk to somebody about it, that's maybe uninitiated or doesn't believe, or they're an atheist or whatever, it's very understandable that they would look at that and be like, well, that you're just talking crazy talk. Okay, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to prove it? You're going to prove? I mean, first you have the problem of proving that there ever was a guy named Jeremiah who did the things that, that book says he did. You have to get historians involved. And most of the time, they're not there to get involved. You know what I mean? Like, they're not... There's a lot of figures in the Bible. In fact, like the story of Goliath, right? That has only been just very recently had an element of actual evidence added to it, right? There was many years ago, 20 years ago or whatever, they found like some clay jar that possibly had the name Goliath inscribed into it in the language that would have been spoken back then. But you know what I mean? Like most of the stuff that's in the Bible, you can't prove it. You can't prove it. You can't prove that there was ever a guy named Caleb, for example, right? My son's namesake, right? Caleb was a very important figure in the establishment of Judea, right? Israel. And the thing is, you can't prove it. He didn't write any books. You know what I mean? There's only stories that are told of him. And that's, you run into a very severe problem of proof. It's just like anything else, like faith, You can't, or proving the existence of God. You can't do it, Neither can you do the inverse. You can't prove that he doesn't exist. You know what I mean? So you run into some very severe problems when you're trying to prove things, and that's another reason. Like, I don't like talking about prophecy because you can't prove anything. It's all speculation, and you could be sitting there as a Christian saying, "Well, wait a minute, Daniel predicted, the coming of the Messiah, and Moses predicted the coming of the Messiah, and then here comes Jesus." It's like, yes, I believe all that too. I'm with you, faithfully. In my faith, I'm with you. I believe all those things are true. And guess what else I believe is true? I believe that I can't prove it, and neither can you. I believe that too, right? You can't prove it. And so when you're talking about something that you can't prove, it's like depending on the audience, you're going to run into a problem of well, why am I even talking about this? Like I said before, like the theory of gravity. I'm not going to talk to you about that. I'll talk to an astrophysicist about it, right? And probably they won't talk to me about it because I myself am not an astrophysicist. When astrophysicists sit around and they talk about gravity, that's going to be a fruitful conversation because they're going after something. You know what I mean? So if we're talking about, Bible prophecy and the second coming of Christ and the building of the third temple and all that stuff, it's like, very quickly into that conversation, we're gonna hit a wall of like, well, why are we even talking about this, right? Because one of the other main components of why I don't like talking about this sort of thing, right? Take the second coming of Christ for example, right? Now, when Jesus was walking around with his disciples, he said he was gonna leave and that he would come back, right? And ever since then, all of the Christian faithful have been awaiting, desperately anticipating the second coming of Jesus Christ. I myself am as well, right? Please, Lord Jesus, come. Please, Lord Jesus, come. That's my prayer. Absolutely. The problem, though, is that every single generation of Christianity, right, including the 11 disciples then made 12 disciples. You know what I mean? Every single generation, including the men who actually walked with Jesus and women, those people believed that they would see the coming of the Lord. They believed it too. Those were his own followers. And every group, every generation ever since then, for 2,000 years, every single generation not only believed that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime, they could also prove it. using Scripture, right? That's a heck of a thing to think about, right? Every single, like, if you go talk to apocalyptic sort of preachers that talk about the second coming of Christ right now, they will be able to walk you through Scripture and give you a very convincing argument that this is the generation of the second coming of Christ, right? And it will be very compelling because they're going to use Scripture, right? And they're going to paint a picture, and it's going to look very clear. But the problem with that is that so could every other generation. Think about this. Like, think about in the 1930s when Hitler arose. That generation of Christians said, this is it. That guy is the Antichrist. He's trying to wipe out all the Jews. And then they could take you through a bunch of scriptures that said, well, this is what the Antichrist is going to do. He's going to try to wipe out all the Jews. Right? You know what I mean? So if you lived in the 1930s, you would have every expectation that you would see the heavens torn apart and the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Right? Every generation had that person. And when I was growing up, it was Mikhail Gorbachev. Right? It was there used to, for you younger listeners, there used to be a nation called the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR. It's no longer available, so it would take me a little work to prove to you that that nation actually used to exist. But it used to exist, and the head of that government during my lifetime was a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, and he had this big, they call it a wine stain, but it's just a birthmark. He had this big birthmark on his forehead. And I remember all of my family members were like, oh, this is the Antichrist. Look, he's got this mark on his head. Right? And I won't take the time to qualify that statement. If you don't know, you can send me a message and I'll put something together for you. But anyways, it was like when I was growing up, he was the Antichrist. And he was the proof that this indeed was the generation that Jesus was going to come back. That's a problem. Right? And then when you look through all of church history and you see, like, well, if every generation was wrong, then mathematically speaking, I am much more likely to be wrong than I am right. Because every generation believed it, including the followers of Jesus Christ, right? The original crew, they believed it too, and they could prove it with Scripture. You know what I mean? Like that creates a problem as far as your faith is concerned. It's like, well, for 2,000 years everybody believed it, so therefore I don't have a reasonable excuse to think that I'm right in the idea that the Christ, right, the Messiah, is going to be coming back in my lifetime. You follow what I'm saying? And because of that, religious fervor and that deep desire of everyone who walks in the name of the Lord, every one of us, all Christians and all Jews, were all awaiting the arrival of the Messiah. The Jews are waiting for the Messiah to show up for the first time. The Christians are waiting for the Messiah to show up for the second time. It's different in that respect, but they're both waiting for the same thing, the Messiah. Right? Now, as you know, as I've pointed out, I approach things a little bit more pragmatically. Right? I don't like getting into the conversations of deeply spiritual things unless it's on a one-on-one basis where I can talk to somebody that I know that I can trust them and that they can trust me. But giving out broad stroke things, it's like one of my deepest fears is becoming a minister, like a paid preacher. You know what I mean? Because I've seen the abuses of men and women who I'm certain that they started off with all of the best intentions, and then somehow they just turned out to be Joel Osteen or Creflo Dollar, these kind of people. You know what I mean? Pat Robertson, for example, who I think is a good guy, but man, he says a lot of really crazy things. Like crazy, like, whoa, Pat, slow down. I don't want to do that. You know what I mean? I don't want my income based on that. I don't want my income based off of how riled up I'm able to get people in regard to their faith, right? So when I talk about things like this, it's like, well, let's just talk about what I can prove, right? Let's talk about what we can prove as it pertains to these times that we're living in, right? And what we know of prophecy, right? So what do we know? Well, just like gravity, right? Like we know that there's gravity. We know that it's there. So in that same sense, let's look at the Bible that way, right? Well, we know that it's there, right? We know somebody wrote it because it's there and it's been around for a very long time. You might want to get into the argument of, well, we don't really know. It could have all been written by one guy. Could have been written by a bunch of monks sitting on top of a mountaintop. Well, maybe, but what we do know, what we cannot argue at all, is that it exists, right? So let's just take that. We know that, right? And when it comes to prophecies, whether you believe that, some of these prophecies have come true or, and some of them have yet to come true, whatever you believe, you have to believe that, well, that it was written. Somebody wrote that down. Somebody wrote it, right? So we can agree on that. Everybody can agree that whether you believe in the prophecies or not, somebody wrote them down, right? You agree? You with me so far? So take, for example, like here's a weird one, because we're gonna be talking about the third temple, and if you don't know what that is, the Jews are all waiting for the ability to build the third temple, right there in Jerusalem, and so are the Christians, because in the book of the Apocalypse, otherwise known as the book of Revelation, it says that when the temple is built, when that third temple is built, that's when things are about to get real interesting. All right. Now, let's go back just and take a look at some of these prophecies. So there was the first temple that was built about 550 years before Christ, right? Or 580 years or something like that. And it was built by King Solomon. Right? So there's a little bit of a backstory here. King David, who was the second king of Israel, and the first king that was appointed by God, and I believe the only one. But again, that's speculation, right? I can't prove that, but that's what the book says. So let's just go with that. All right. So King David loved God. And it says in the Bible that God loved him so much that he said that this, he spoke this particular blessing over him. He said that this is a man who is after my heart, right? And you can interpret that a lot of different ways, but it was certainly high praise from the Almighty himself, right? The problem is that King David, although he loved God very much and was very particular about his spiritual life, he also had some flaws. He liked to kill people a lot, and that became a problem because towards the end of David's life, he was dedicated himself to the idea of okay, I'm sorry. You know what? Let me pause right there. Put a little pin in what I just said. In those days of King David, the temple of God was in a tent, right? There was like a little tent encampment. There was an outer wall of curtains, right? And then, the priests would go in the outer wall of those curtains, and there was another tent inside of those walls. And inside of that tent was what was called the Holy of Holies. Actually, it was, you go into the first wall, and then there was a tent, and you go into that tent, and inside of that tent, there was another chamber where only the high priest was allowed to go, right? All the other priests, they could go inside the outer court, and then they could go into the new tent, or the outer tent, but only the high priest was allowed to go into like the inner chamber, that tent within the tent, right? So there was like 3 stages. There was outer, the tent itself, and then the inner tent. And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And the Ark of the Covenant, if you don't know what that is, if you ever saw Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it was that. In fact, it looked, the Ark of the Covenant most likely looked exactly like what you saw in that movie. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. King David had he had grown his kingdom, right? He became very wealthy, and in his spiritual gratefulness and exuberance, he wanted to build a structure out of stone with a foundation and with a roof and everything. And he prayed to God, and he consulted with his prophets, mainly Nathan, and there was a couple other ones, but he desired to build a temple. And so he prayed and prayed and prayed, and then God spoke through the prophet, and I believe it was Nathan, and he said, listen, God is not going to allow you to build this because you have blood on your hands. And furthermore, actually, I'm sorry, I screwed that part up. Put a pin in that. Go back a little bit further. First, the prophets came to him and said, God said, no, he doesn't want a building. That was the first thing that happened. God said to David through his prophets, he said, listen, I'm happy with my tent. I don't want a building. I like the tent. A tent represents the home. And I want people to always believe that, that's the kind of God I am. Right? I'm a tent dwelling. I'm the God who lives with you in your house, right? And I'm happy with my tent. But King David, and yet he persisted. So he kept praying, and finally the prophets came to him and said, okay, listen, God said, you can have your temple, but you're not allowed to build it because you have blood on your hands. So take a pin out of that. So first God said, no, I don't want that. And then God said, all right, I can see this is very important to you, so I'll tell you what. You can't build it, but what you can do is design it. All right? You can design it, and then, whoever the next king is, your son Solomon, he can build it. I just don't want, bloody hands building my temple. All right, so fair enough. So King Solomon built the first temple, right? So that was the first one, and it was magnificent, right? Now, before I get into the second temple and then the third temple, there's a couple of things that are of note about that first temple. I think it was about 80 years later or so, and forgive me if I'm getting the dates wrong, but it wasn't very long afterwards that Solomon had completed the building of that temple, and the ark was moved into that temple, that Israel was besieged by the Babylonians, and they were all taken off into slavery. And but before that happened, there were other prophecies about other temples, right? There was well, let me not get into that. Let me just kind of skip ahead. So they're in slavery to Babylon. Right? And there were two prophets, right? Israel's no longer a nation, and the temple has been destroyed, right? The outer walls have been taken out, everything, right? And the people are mostly living in what is modern-day Iraq, right? And there were two prophets at that time that worked for the king of Babylon, and one of them's name is Daniel, and his friends. So you remember the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Okay, well, that's Daniel and his two friends. And there was another prophet who did not live inside the castle with the king. He was a kind of a wild man, and his name was Ezekiel. And Ezekiel and Daniel knew each other, and they most likely didn't like one another. But they were both prophets. And at that time, right, the first temple had been destroyed. King Solomon's temple had been destroyed. And at that time, Daniel had prophesied about a second temple and a third temple. And Ezekiel prophesied about a third temple. Now that's weird, right? Because the second one hadn't been built yet, right? So you got to think about it in this context, right? Like if you were standing in front of, say, like the Empire State Building, right? Or you know what? Let's make it something a little bit harder to destroy. if you were standing in front of the Egyptian pyramids, right? Like let's say you won a small lottery and you decided you were going to take your family on vacation to Egypt because you wanted to see the pyramids, right? And you and your family go to Egypt and you're standing there looking at the pyramids and you're like, oh, cool, man. That must have taken a lot of work. And you're taking selfies, click, 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 and you're just having a good old time. And all of a sudden, I walk up to you and I say, hey, man, don't worry, all right? These pyramids are going to be rebuilt. Just don't worry, right? You would look at me like, okay, first of all, I'm not worried. I wasn't even thinking that. And furthermore, what are you talking about? Like, they're sitting right there. Why are you saying that this is going to be rebuilt? It's not even been destroyed. And it couldn't be destroyed. Right? Those are solid blocks of, you know what I mean? Like you would look at me like a crazy person. That's how significant it was for those people to be making predictions about the future, about a third temple. It was absurd at the time because there wasn't even a second temple yet, right? And there were other prophets that once the second temple had been built, and by the way, the second temple was built by King Herod. All right, now King Herod was an absolute, now this is from what we know of history, like what we can prove, because King Herod lived 2,000 years ago, and just over. And so, that was during the Roman occupation, and there were journalists back then, like we have actual historic proof that there was a guy named Herod, and he did build the second temple, and he built a lot of other things. King Herod was an absolute genius when it came to architecture. King Herod's architectural schematics are still studied to this day and taught in universities, right? He's a very important man when it comes to the history of architecture. He was also so much of a genius that he was a crazy person, an absolute, like he was paranoid. He had his sons killed because he was afraid that his sons were trying to kill him to overtake the throne or whatever. Like he was a crazy person. But he was also a mad genius, you know what I mean? So he built the second temple, and that's the temple that we see in the Gospels when Jesus was talking about, like, I'm going to tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days, and that whole thing. There were prophecies even at that time when the prophet said, okay, don't worry everybody, the third temple will be built. And so naturally those people would say, what are you talking about, third temple? That we have this one, it's magnificent. There's no way to tear this down, right? The stones are too big, it's too beautiful, like, what are you talking about a third temple? We already have this. Prophesying about something like that would be absurd at the time. And I think we lose that when we can look at the prophecy and be like, ooh, wow, this person could see the future. But it's like, no, you have to remember, like, these were actual people. And they lived in an actual society where everybody was normal. You know what I mean? So to have somebody come up and come up to you while you're standing at the pyramids, and if I said, don't worry, these pyramids are going to be rebuilt, you'd be like, what? What are you talking about? Rebuilt. They're standing right there. It would sound absurd. So, but as we know from historical documents, that temple was torn down by Nero, right? Emperor Nero, I believe. But we know that it was torn down and that every stone was removed. That there was nothing left of that temple. So, the third temple. This is, and I'm sorry that it took me a half an hour to get to this point, but the third temple, that's what all the Christian people and all the Jewish people, it's what we're all waiting for, right? That's going to herald in the second coming of Jesus Christ. Or for the Jews, it's, the first coming of the Messiah. Well, actually, for Jews, there is actually no tie between the temple and the timing of the arrival of the Messiah, but that's a different topic. Now, Israel has been a state now since 1947, right? And everybody has been eagerly anticipating the building of that third temple, right? Now again, try to keep in mind Every single generation for 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple has been convinced that it was their generation that was going to see the rebuilding of the Third Temple. Even though there was no such thing as a nation called Israel, right? Which is kind of important if you really look at it. Now there's a nation called Israel, and since the inception of that nation, and because was it President Truman that started the new nation of Israel? You say, well, my Bible says Israel goes here. Did you know that they were going to give the Jews, I think it was like Australia or something like that. They were going to give the Jewish people their own piece of land and just say, okay, well, here's your land. But then President Truman stepped in and said, no, the Bible says the Jews go here. This is where Israel is. We're going to give them that. That's why we have that nation state. But anyways, let me digress off of that prophecy, and let me try to bring this all back. Let me ride this wagon back into the stable. All right. We are living in very interesting times for sure. All right. Now I could point out that people seem to be losing their minds right now, which is one of the forecasters of the end of all days. Right? It says that people will see evil and call it good, and they will see good and call it evil. We're certainly seeing that. But, what generation could not say that? Right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this whole thing about, during Hitler's reign. He wrote this whole thing, and he basically said, look, evil's one thing. Like, Hitler is an evil guy, and that's bad, and you can kill evil, right? And if you kill an evil person, you've done good. Kill an evil person, you've rid the world of an element of evil. But he made the point, he's like, that's not the only problem here. The problem is that Hitler is evil and the Germans are stupid. People are behaving stupidly. It's not just that Hitler's a bad guy, it's that everybody's buying his bullshit. They're stupid. And what are you going to do? Are you going to kill a stupid person? What will that accomplish? If you say you killed Hitler, you've done good. You killed an evil person. But if you kill a stupid person, then that's exactly what you've done. You've killed a stupid person. What does that make you? You know what I mean? Like, that's I believe that was kind of like the whole point of what Bonhoeffer wrote in that letter. He was saying, look, man, yeah, evil's a problem, but man, stupid is a whole nother problem. And so as we look around ourselves today, it's like, yes, there's evil. George Soros is evil. Hillary Clinton is evil. Barack Obama is evil. But that's not the only problem. It's that, man, there's a whole bunch of people that are just buying their bullshit. That's a real problem. Stupid is a real problem. So you can look around and you can make the case like, well, the Bible says, people will say that, pedophilia is good, and Mike Pence refusing to eat dinner alone with another woman is bad. You know what I mean? Like, we can make that case, but the problem, as I was saying before, the problem with that is that so could everybody. So could every generation for the last 2,000 years. They could all say the exact same thing, right? But how can we take a pragmatic look at what's going on today and not get off into what Tim Ferriss calls like woo-woo spirituality about the building of that third temple? How can we take a pragmatic look at this so that we're not getting off into territory where people can easily dispute it? You know what I mean? Now, what do we know? Right? We know that there is a book that is over 2,000 years old at least, and is more like 2,500 years old. Book of Daniel and Ezra and Ezekiel, and the people who prophesied about the third temple before and during the time of the second temple. We know that they prophesied about a third temple. That is not disputable, right? It was written down, and it was written down over 2,000 years ago. That's no one can dispute that happened. Those people that have the argument like, well, the Bible could have very well have been written by a bunch of monks living on top of a mountain. It's like, okay, okay, you can believe that. What you cannot believe, though, is that took place less than 2,000 years ago. Right? We know that every single one of those books was written 2,000 years ago or more. Right? So 2,000 years ago, people wrote down that, like, we believe that there's going to be a third temple. So that's by itself, that is a fact, right? That people wrote it down. And ever since then, people have been awaiting that third temple. You can't dispute that either. We can see that all through written history, that the Jews and the Christians have been awaiting for the arrival of that third temple. Right? Now, why hasn't it been built? There's a number of really good reasons. Logistical reasons. Like, one, as I mentioned before, there was no such thing as Israel for many, many years, right? Almost 2,000 years. There was no place such as Israel. It only just recently became a country again in your parents' lifetime, right? So not long ago. There are people who are alive today that were alive when there was no such thing as Israel. So that's a problem. There's also another problem, is that where a lot of scholars believed that the original two temples were, is now being occupied by another building called the Mosque of Omar, or the Temple of Omar, or whatever, the dome on top that you see in pictures, like that real pretty golden looking building. Well, there's a lot of people that for a very long time have believed that that's where the temple was, right? Well, I might circle back around to that. Actually, let me get to that right now. There's a lot of scholars nowadays that believe that that's actually not true, that the temple was actually somewhere else, very close to there, but not precisely right there. But there's one big problem about building that third temple that is key, and you won't hear people arguing about this very much. And why? I have no idea, but I'm going to get to that right now. Now, one of the things is obvious, is that we don't have the Ark of the Covenant, right? There's kind of no point in building a building that has a room in it called the Holy of Holies unless the Ark of the Covenant is in there. But there's another problem, right? This is the problem that a lot of people don't talk about. Now, again, remember, I promised you that I would bring this back around to pragmatic thinking, right? Practical, verifiable, these kinds of thoughts, right? One of the major problems with building a third temple is that you would have to have a reason why, right? And that reason can't be because we want to have a building that we built, right? The purpose of the temple is for ceremony, right? Religious ceremonies, sacrifices to the Almighty, prayer, and one of the things that you have to have if you're going to have a temple is a high priest. All right. Now this is what I really wanted to get to. You have to have a high priest. If you're going to have a temple, you have to already have a high priest ready, at the ready. Now this is a problem because Jews are they're very concerned about their lineage, right? Their family tree. You know how you can go on to whatever it is, the thing that the Mormons own, the familytree.com or whatever, and you can see your family history. Well, that's because the Mormons are very interested in bloodlines and what's the word I'm looking, like genealogy. I'm sorry, genealogy. The Mormons are very concerned about that. That's one of their things, right? But nobody's more concerned about genealogy than Jews. No one. It's not even close. Now, up until about 2,000 years ago, every single Jew could tell you their entire family line going all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? They could line it up, well, or at least back to Noah. They could tell you like who their entire family tree was. every one of them, right? And it was all written down. And when Nero destroyed the second temple, he didn't just destroy that second temple. He destroyed that whole city and destroyed the nation of Israel and destroyed all of their records, right? The problem about building that third temple is that there is no high priest because the Jews can no longer prove their bloodlines. They can't prove their genealogies, right? In Judaism, there's only one. There's 12 tribes, right? And only one of those tribes is allowed to be priests. They're called the Levites, right? And not only do you have to be a Levite to be a high priest, you also have to come from inside of that lineage. You have to come from a line of priests, and not only that, but you have to be the firstborn son of a firstborn son of a firstborn son. You know what I mean? You can. You have to be a firstborn son, so does your father, so does your grandfather, like all the way back, right? If you're going to be a priest, those are the rules, right? And so if you're going to build a temple, you have to have a high priest. And if you cannot prove your qualifications as to be a high priest, then you run the risk of being profane in the temple of the Lord. Right? Because those are God's rules. You have to be of this tribe and you have to be of this particular genealogy. And if you're not those things, then you can't be the high priest. So the Jews are not going to build a temple unless they can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the priests and the high priest are all people who belong there and will not profane the name of the Lord by their mere presence. Right? So why did I just tell you all that? Well, as I said, for 2,000 years, there's been they've had no records, right? They've had no way of proving who their genealogical identity is for 2,000 years. They've not been able to prove that. But guess what? You can now go online and pay $30 or whatever it is, right, to have a little box sent to your house where you can stick a needle in your finger or in your arm or wherever it is, or pull a hair out of your head, whatever. Send it back to this company, and they will check your DNA, and they'll be able to tell you where your great great grandparents lived 500 years ago, right? Oh, your great great grandparents lived in the Caucasus Mountains, or they lived in the south of France. Or they lived in with remarkable accuracy, right? See what I'm saying? You see where I'm going? There's another thing. I have a friend. Let me tell you about my friend. His name is Dr. Matthew. I call him Dr. Matthew because he never insisted that I call him doctor. So I always make sure to call him doctor. Now, Dr. Matthew was very young when he received his PhD, and what he does for a living. Right? He works for a company in central to southern California, a little town. He lives in the county of San Luis Obispo, so that's above LA, beneath San Francisco. What he does for a living, he works for a company that makes cancer medication. Right? One of the main problems with cancer medication is that it's very hard. It's very foreign to the human bloodstream. And so when people get cancer and they take the cancer medication, the main problem with it is that the reason it doesn't work is because the blood will not absorb it. It'd be like eating a spoonful of concrete. Your body just would not metabolize it. It doesn't belong there, right? That's what cancer medication is like. The body has a natural defense against things that are that foreign to it. Right? So when you take cancer medication, your blood responds to it like it's an enemy, like it's something to be rejected and fought against. And so what Dr. Matthew does, and the company that he works for, what they do is if you have cancer, they'll take your blood and they'll study your DNA, right? And they'll make this cancer medication so that it's only for your particular DNA. Think about that. Like, we have figured out the blood to that level. I'm sure there's way more to learn, but we've figured that much out. And so this guy makes a medication that will only work on you. It's only for your blood because we have decoded DNA to that extent. And by the way, that cancer medication, it costs like $250,000, right? So, you know, if you get cancer, I hope you're rich. But that's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing that like we have that technology now. We have the technology where we can just get something in the mail and get just a little sample of blood, send it in, and people, you know, the people on the other end, they're going to take your blood, they can study it, and they can say, well, your parents came from Siberia, right? 800 years ago, like with that kind of accuracy. So now, what is different about the coming of that third temple, the building of that third temple, is that now we have a verifiable mechanism, right? We know that that technology exists. There's no disputing it. We know that should the Jews be so inclined, if they wanted to find out beyond a shadow of a doubt who is eligible to be a priest and who is eligible to be the high priest, they can now do it. That's what's different about these days versus the last 2,000 years, you know, the generations of the last 2,000 years. That's what's different, right? So pragmatically, like, so let's take spirituality and pragmatism, try to put them both together. Can we at least, dear atheist or dear non-believer or whatever, can we at least agree that those things are true, right? That we can now, you know, we've decoded blood to that level. And that, you know, if you study Judaism to any extent, you would also know that what I said about the importance of knowing who the high priest is, you know, vital to the building of the third temple. It's vital, right? That's one thing, is that you know, they can either prove it now or they're very close to being able to prove it. That puts us closer. And why does that put us closer? Well, here's another thing. Here's another interesting, fun fact that is a fact and is, again, it's not up for argument. Everybody knows this. This is a fact. Since the inception of the new Israel, the orthodoxy, the Jews that are Jews by not only birth but by religion, they have been preparing for the building of that third temple ever since that day. They've been cutting cornerstones, they've been cutting foundation stones, they've been cutting the cedar, right? Because one of the stipulations of the temple is that the frames and the wood, all the wood in it has to be this particular type of cedar, and they've been collecting all of that stuff ever since. All of the materials for the third temple, they're all ready. They're all cut and ready, right? It's not just like there's just logs in the backyard. Like, no, those logs have been turned into lumber. They've been cut. They're ready. Every single thing that is going to go into that third temple, it's already been prepared. All they're waiting for is the go-ahead. And there's two major problems with the go-ahead. One, they're not sure where those temples were. The first one and the second one, they're not 100% positive that the first two temples were under what is now a Muslim holy site. And two, they don't know who the high priest is. There are other prophecies, right, that would denote that actually the first two temples were not built where the Dome of Omar or whatever it's called wasn't there. There's very compelling reasons to believe that it's not in prophecy and in architecture, right? Both of those two things coming together. So what do we have now? What do we have? We have a nation state of Israel. We have an eager Jewish people, right? They want to build that temple. They've been wanting to build it ever since, right? So we need two things to see that temple built. We need an established, verified, proof beyond proof that the temple goes somewhere, right? They either need to prove that it's underneath the Dome of Omar, or they need to prove that it was somewhere else. The city of David, which, by the way, is... I don't really want to get into that because it's like, well, I can't prove any of it. But there's reason to believe that the temple was actually just slightly to the right, right, of where that Muslim holy site is. And it's just that. It's where do we put it and who's going to be the high priest. Those are the only two obstacles. And up until just recently, that priest problem was out of the question. There was no way to solve that problem. Just recently, we have come up with a solution of that problem. And if we get to the point to where they figure out that, well, we don't need to build it underneath the Temple of Omar, or whatever that thing is called. If they find the foundation of the Temple of Solomon somewhere else, which I personally believe that they will find it, and it will be somewhere else, very close to the other site, then that's going to be all she wrote, right? Because we already have the blood technology, and that's all they need. Furthermore, the United States, who has been the protector of Israel, right? Well, the second protector of Israel. Obviously, God is the protector of Israel. But the United States just moved its embassy to Jerusalem. Now, that may not seem like very much, but that was huge. And I could get into why that is, but that's a big step. That is a clear message to the rest of the world is that the Christians stand with the Jews. And we stand with Israel, right? And they will have our full support for as long as we both shall live, right? So these are very interesting times as it applies to that third temple. So everybody's waiting for it, and now we have good reason to believe that this is in fact the generation that will see it. It pains me to say that out loud because I know, mathematically speaking, how very likely it is that I'm just one of many generations saying, oh, I think that this is the generation and it's going to happen. But, given those facts, who knows? Anyways, I will get further into crazy talk like this on other episodes. Like this, again, these are very exciting times. I know that I am under the full belief and a full faith that I too have a word to deliver, right? And so do you. That every one of us is a word from God sent down to accomplish a purpose. And I believe that you have that as much as I do. And perhaps this podcast will help me to come to the place where I'm able to deliver whatever it is that I have to say. And you should find your outlet, right? Be it a podcast, be it a YouTube channel or writing a book, or a small book. It doesn't have to be a novel, just whatever. You know what I mean? Whatever it is that you have that you need to communicate, get it out. Get it out. Because one thing I am convinced of is that we will not get through whatever period this is that we're going through without doing it together as a community. I believe that with all of my heart. In the name of the Lord, I believe that. And we need to come together. So, listen, join us on the Telegram page. Join me on my Twitter page and follow the people that follow me and follow back and all that other stuff. Keep in contact, right? You can go onto my website, archadvocate.com. You can go down to the bottom. Click on any one of those social medias. Click on all of them. Go to my Gab AI page. Go to my Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Join. Come together. That's how we're going to get through this. We're going to get through this together. And that's what I have to say today. You guys have a good weekend. Gonna miss ya. Old Blue Eyes gonna miss ya. That's it. Hey, that was kind of fun. Would you guys send me a message? Let me know what you thought about today's episode. I don't really get too far into the woods on that sort of thing, but I just, that's been in my mind for a while. I've been trying to explain that kind of thing to my wife. It's all kind of new to her. That's it. Talk to you on Monday.